Hey guys! Tonight, we're stepping quietly into one of the most heavily guarded places in the ancient world, the private bedroom of a Roman emperor. You might imagine that the most powerful man on earth drifted peacefully to sleep each night, but the truth was often very different. Many Roman emperors feared poison, assassination, bad dreams, and even the warnings of the gods before they could finally close their eyes. They followed strange nighttime rituals involving scented oils, physicians, whispered prayers, expensive perfumes, trusted servants, and guards who remained awake until sunrise. Some refused to sleep alone, others believed their dreams could predict the future. And a few became so frightened of betrayal that they barely slept at all. But before we begin, if you enjoy relaxing journeys into the stranger side of history, please consider subscribing. And if you're listening tonight, I'd love to know where you're joining from and what time it is where you are. Now, settle into your favorite chair, relax your shoulders, let your mind grow wonderfully heavy, and together, let's step beyond the guarded doors into the bizarre bedtime world of Rome's most powerful emperors. Imagine, for a moment, that the sun has disappeared behind the hills of Italy. The last warm light of evening has faded from the marble walls of the imperial palace. Outside, Rome is slowly becoming quieter. The busy streets have emptied. Merchants have pulled their wooden shutters closed. The voices of travelers have softened into distant murmurs, but inside the palace, the night is only beginning. A servant moves silently through a corridor, carrying a small bronze lamp. Its flame trembles gently as he walks. Somewhere nearby, water drips into a stone basin. The faint fragrance of rose petals and herbs lingers in the warm air. At the end of the corridor stands a guarded doorway. Behind it, the emperor is preparing for sleep. To reach this room, you might first have to pass through several layers of servants, officials, and soldiers. The emperor's bedroom was not simply a private place in the modern sense. It was part of a carefully controlled world where access could mean trust, influence, and sometimes life or death. The person who entered that room at night might be carrying medicine, or a message, or a cup of wine, and sometimes an emperor could not be entirely certain which one it was. This was the strange contradiction of imperial life. The emperor possessed enormous wealth. He could sleep beneath embroidered fabrics, surrounded by polished marble, carved furniture, perfumes, and precious objects brought from distant provinces, yet luxury could never completely purchase peace of mind. The higher a person climbed in Roman society, the more valuable his life became to those who wished to protect him, and to those who wished to remove him, so bedtime became something more complicated than simply lying down. It could involve preparations that had been repeated for years. Familiar servants might arrange the room. Lamps could be positioned carefully. The temperature had to be comfortable. The emperor might bathe, eat, drink, pray, consult a physician, or listen to music, and somewhere beyond the walls, men remained awake. Watching, waiting, listening for footsteps. The darkness itself seemed to change the palace. During the day, power was visible. Officials came and went. Petitioners waited. Messengers delivered news from across the empire. But at night, when the emperor finally withdrew from public view, power became invisible. It became a question: who was allowed to come close, who could be trusted, who would still be there when morning arrived? These questions followed Roman emperors into the quietest hours of their lives. And beneath the grand architecture of the palace, beneath the gold and marble, was something surprisingly familiar. A human being, trying to feel safe enough to sleep. The rituals surrounding that simple act could be elaborate. expensive, and sometimes wonderfully strange, but they also revealed something about the people who ruled Rome, because when the doors were closed and the lamps burned low, even an emperor could become a little afraid of the night. And so, before we enter the bedroom itself, we must first understand why darkness held such a powerful place in the imagination of imperial Rome. Because for the emperor, night was never simply the absence of daylight. It was a world of possibilities hidden just beyond the edge of the lamp's gentle glow. The palace grows quieter as the night deepens. Behind us, the last sounds of evening have faded into distant echoes, and the emperor's private chamber waits beyond its guarded doors. Yet before sleep can come, there is something that must be understood. For the Roman emperor, darkness was not always a time of rest. It was a time when certainty disappeared. During daylight, the emperor could see the people around him. He could observe the faces of senators, officials, servants, soldiers, and visitors. He could read their expressions. He could ask questions. He could summon someone into his presence and demand an explanation. But at night, the world became smaller. The emperor was surrounded by walls, curtains, shadows, and locked doors, and in that darkness, the imagination could become almost as powerful as reality. Ancient Rome was a society where rumors traveled quickly, and fear of political betrayal was never entirely absent. The imperial throne had enormous rewards, but it also carried enormous dangers. An emperor could be surrounded by wealth and still wonder who might secretly wish to see him gone. This fear was not entirely irrational. Roman history contained stories of rulers who were poisoned, stabbed, strangled, or betrayed by people they had trusted. Some emperors died in battle. Others died suddenly in circumstances that left historians wondering what had really happened. So when an emperor finally climbed into bed, the thought of sleep could carry an uncomfortable question. What if he never woke? Imagine lying beneath luxurious coverings in a room filled with expensive objects, knowing that your position had made you one of the most important people in the world, and perhaps one of the most vulnerable. The emperor's enemies did not always need an army. Sometimes, they only needed access. A servant carrying food, a messenger with a letter, a physician with a bottle, a familiar face appearing at the wrong hour. This is one reason the private spaces of emperors could be carefully controlled. The fewer people who came close to the sleeping ruler, the easier it was to know who had been there. Yet another fear belonged to the ancient imagination, the fear of poison. Romans were familiar with the idea that death could arrive invisibly, mixed into food or drink. Stories of poisoned banquets and suspicious meals became part of the political culture of the empire. For an emperor, every evening meal could therefore contain a small question: was this safe? Was the person who prepared it trustworthy? Had someone tampered with it? Such fears sometimes led to elaborate precautions. Food might be tasted by others before it reached the emperor. Drinks could be handled carefully. Trusted attendants became more than servants, they became part of the emperor's personal security. And then there were the gods. The Roman world was filled with signs: a strange dream, a bird appearing at an unusual moment, a sudden sound in the night, a disturbing vision, a priest's warning. To modern eyes, these events might seem unrelated. But to many ancient Romans, the boundary between ordinary life and divine messages was much thinner. The night, especially, could feel like a time when hidden things became visible. A dream might be remembered in the morning and discussed for hours. Was it meaningless? Was it a message from a god? Was it a warning about an enemy? Was it a glimpse of something yet to come? For an emperor, such questions carried unusual weight. The ruler of Rome was expected to understand signs and maintain the favor of the gods. If a troubling dream appeared, it might not be dismissed as an ordinary nightmare, it could become a political concern, and so, the emperor's bed became a strange meeting place between private fear and public responsibility. A man might close his eyes hoping for rest, only to wake wondering whether his dream had revealed something important. Perhaps this is why the nighttime world of the Roman emperor was so carefully managed. The darkness outside could not be controlled, but the darkness inside the palace could be softened, lamps could be lit, curtains could be drawn, guards could take their positions. Servants could remain nearby, perfumes could fill the air, and eventually, the emperor could retreat into a carefully prepared space where every object had its place, yet even the most luxurious room needed preparation, because if sleep was to arrive peacefully, the chamber itself had to be made ready, and that is where our journey now takes us, past the quiet guards, through the heavy doorway, and into the imperial bedroom, where the ancient Roman night truly begins. Beyond the guarded entrance, the palace becomes strangely still. The sounds of footsteps seem farther away now, softened by thick walls and long corridors. Somewhere outside, Rome continues beneath the darkness, but here, inside the imperial residence, another world is taking shape. The emperor's bedroom is being prepared, not hurriedly, not noisily, but with the quiet precision of people who have performed the same tasks many times before. Before an emperor could surrender himself to sleep, the room around him had to feel right, the bed had to be ready, the lamps had to be placed. The air had to be pleasant, the doors had to be watched. And the people allowed inside had to be known. It is easy to imagine an imperial bedroom as an enormous room filled with gold, surrounded by endless luxury. Sometimes, of course, imperial residences were astonishingly elaborate. But the actual sleeping space could be more intimate than the grand public halls of a palace. This was where the emperor stepped away from his official identity. Here, he was no longer seated before petitioners, he was not listening to senators, he was not receiving military reports. For a few hours, he was simply a man preparing to close his eyes, and that required a different kind of environment. The servants assigned to the room might begin by arranging the bed itself. Roman beds could be constructed from wood or other materials and decorated according to the wealth of their owner. For an emperor, the frame might be beautifully carved, with expensive fabrics and carefully woven coverings. The mattress would need to be comfortable enough for a ruler accustomed to luxury, but comfort was not the only concern. The room had to remain orderly. A careless servant could disturb the emperor's rest. A badly placed lamp might cast an irritating shadow. A draft from an opening could make the room uncomfortable. Small details mattered. After all, when a person has immense power, the smallest inconveniences can become strangely noticeable. Perhaps a servant would straighten the coverings, another might move a lamp slightly closer, someone else might check that the curtains were properly positioned. The emperor might enter the room and notice almost nothing. That was the point. Good preparation was invisible. The room should appear as though it had simply become ready by itself, yet there was another element that made the imperial bedroom different from an ordinary Roman home. Privacy. For most people in the ancient world, privacy was limited. Families lived close together. Servants, relatives, children, and guests might share the same spaces. In crowded cities, even the sounds of neighbors could travel easily through narrow streets and thin walls. The emperor, however, lived inside a world where privacy had to be organized. His bedroom could be protected by layers of controlled access. People who entered were not necessarily random visitors. They belonged to a system. Servants knew where they were expected to stand. Guards knew which doors they were responsible for. Officials understood when they were permitted to approach. and the emperor himself knew which faces he could expect to see. This arrangement created a strange kind of comfort. The emperor could be alone, without ever truly being alone. Beyond the door, someone was always nearby. The sound of a sandal against stone could remind him that another human being was awake. A quiet voice in the corridor might signal that the night watch was continuing normally. The distant movement of a guard could become part of the rhythm of sleep, but even in this carefully controlled world, there were uncertainties. What if the emperor became ill? What if he woke suddenly? What if a messenger arrived with urgent news? What if an unexpected sound came from somewhere inside the palace? The bedroom had to be prepared for all of these possibilities, and gradually, the room would become softer, the lamps would burn lower, the servants would become quieter, the emperor's garments would be set aside. The final objects of the evening would be arranged within easy reach. Outside, the darkness would deepen. Inside, warm light would touch the walls, and slowly, the vast machinery of imperial life would begin to disappear. But before the emperor could settle beneath the blankets, another part of the evening often awaited him: the Roman bath. For many wealthy Romans, bathing was far more than a quick act of cleanliness. It was a social experience, a ritual, and a way of preparing the body for relaxation. And for an emperor, surrounded by wealth beyond ordinary imagination, even the simple act of washing before bed could become something elaborate, so as the final lamps flicker inside the sleeping chamber. We leave the quiet bed behind for a moment. Down another corridor, warm air rises from stone rooms filled with steam, and somewhere beyond the bedroom, water is waiting. The quiet corridor leads us farther into the palace, and now, instead of the soft darkness of the bedroom, we enter a warmer world. The air changes first. It becomes heavy with moisture, carrying the gentle scent of heated stone and water. Somewhere nearby, a fountain trickles into a shallow basin. The sound is slow and continuous, almost like rain heard from inside a sheltered room. This is the bathing area, and for a Roman emperor, bathing could be one of the most important transitions between the busy world of the day and the private stillness of night. To understand the Roman relationship with bathing, it helps to forget the modern idea of simply taking a quick shower. For wealthy Romans, bathing could be a long experience. It could involve warmth, conversation, exercise, massage, grooming, and relaxation. The great public bathhouses of Rome were among the most impressive buildings in the ancient world. But emperors also had access to private bathing facilities, where they could enjoy the experience without the crowds and noise of public life. Tonight, we remain inside the imperial residence. The emperor has finished his duties, the petitions have been heard, the messengers have departed, and now, as evening settles over Rome, the body begins to slow. A servant might prepare the bathing rooms before the emperor arrived. Water had to be heated. Towels and garments had to be arranged. The room needed to be comfortable, and the sequence of bathing had to be carefully organized. Roman bathing traditions often involved moving through different temperatures. A person might begin in a cooler area before gradually entering warmer surroundings. The experience could progress toward rooms filled with heated air and steam. For an emperor accustomed to being served, every stage could be attended by others. Servants might assist with clothing, they could prepare oils, they might help with grooming afterward. The emperor could simply move through the ritual at his own pace. Imagine the scene. The palace outside is becoming dark, but inside the bathing rooms, soft light flickers against pale stone. Steam rises slowly toward the ceiling. The emperor sits quietly, perhaps allowing the warmth to loosen the tension of the day. There is no Senate meeting here. No military report, no crowded audience. For a short time, the empire can wait. The warmth of the bath could also serve a practical purpose. A day spent wearing heavy clothing, moving through public ceremonies, or sitting for long periods could leave the body tired. Warm water and heated rooms offered a welcome change. The Romans understood the relationship between bathing and comfort, even if they explained the body differently from modern medicine. They also valued cleanliness and grooming as important parts of civilized life. For an emperor, appearance mattered enormously. His body was constantly seen by others. His clothing communicated status. His hair, beard, and skin were part of his public image. But at night, the purpose of bathing could become more private. The emperor was no longer preparing to be seen. He was preparing to disappear from view. Perhaps his hair was carefully dried. Perhaps his skin was rubbed with oil. Perhaps his feet were washed and tended by attendants. The room might slowly grow quieter as the final stages of the ritual came to an end, and there was something deeply soothing about the repetition. Water, warmth, silence, the gentle movement of servants, the flicker of lamps, the emperor's breathing becoming slower. In a palace filled with political uncertainty, these small physical sensations could offer a rare feeling of control. Yet the bath itself was not always entirely private. The emperor's servants could be present. Trusted attendants might remain close. Their role was not merely practical. They were witnesses to the emperor's most vulnerable moments. A ruler who commanded armies and governed provinces was, after all, still a human body that needed washing, drying, grooming, and care. The bath revealed this truth more clearly than almost anywhere else. The emperor could possess statues in his likeness, but statues did not need baths. The empire might call him divine, but he still became tired. And when the warm water finally began to cool, the emperor would leave the bathing room and return toward the sleeping chamber. His skin would be clean, his body would feel lighter, the day's dust and sweat would be gone. But another transformation was about to take place. The scent of the bath would remain on his skin, and now, in the quiet bedroom, attendants would begin the next part of the evening. Small containers would be opened, perfumes would be prepared, oils would be warmed. Between careful hands, the emperor was moving from water into fragrance, and as the palace settled deeper into night, the air itself would soon become part of the ritual of sleep. The emperor leaves the warm bathing rooms behind, and slowly, the atmosphere changes once again. The heavy warmth of steam begins to disappear. Cool night air waits in the corridor, carrying the faint scent of stone and extinguished lamps. But upon the emperor's skin, another fragrance remains: oil, perhaps myrrh, perhaps rose, perhaps an expensive perfume brought from a distant corner of the Roman world. In the ancient Mediterranean, scent was not merely something pleasant, it was part of daily life. Perfumes could mark wealth, status, cleanliness, celebration, and even religious devotion. And for a Roman emperor, surrounded by servants and resources, the possibilities were almost endless. Now, as the night deepens, the emperor enters another quiet stage of his bedtime routine. A servant approaches carrying a small container. It may be made of glass, bronze, ceramic, or another carefully crafted material. Inside is a fragrant oil. The emperor sits while an attendant prepares it. Perhaps only a small amount is needed. The servant pours a little into the palm of his hand and gently warms it between his fingers. Then comes the ritual of application. Oil might be placed on the arms, across the shoulders, along the hands, perhaps lightly through the hair. The movements are slow and deliberate. There is no need to hurry. The day's obligations are finished. The emperor does not have to move quickly from one appointment to another. For the first time in many hours, the clock of public life seems to have stopped. The fragrance rises gently through the room. It mixes with the warm smell of the oil lamps. the faint remains of the bath, the linen of the bed, the cool air entering through a distant opening. Together, these scents create something almost invisible, a private atmosphere. The Romans understood that fragrance could transform a room. A space that smelled ordinary could become luxurious with the addition of perfume. A body that had just been washed could become associated with wealth and refinement. Even the air around a powerful person could announce his status before he spoke. Some perfumes came from plants and resins that had traveled enormous distances. The Roman world was connected by trade routes stretching across the Mediterranean and beyond. Fragrant ingredients could arrive from Arabia, Africa, Asia, and other distant lands. To the emperor, these scents might seem effortless, a small container opened by a servant, and suddenly, the distant world had entered the bedroom. But perfume also had another quality. It could influence memory. A familiar scent can remain in the mind long after a person has left a place. Perhaps an emperor who used the same fragrance night after night eventually came to associate it with sleep, the smell of oil, the glow of lamps, the soft texture of linen, the quiet voice of a servant. These sensations could become signals that the day was finally ending, and perhaps this was one of the simplest comforts available to someone whose life was otherwise filled with constant demands. The emperor could not control what the senators thought. He could not control rumors. Traveling through the city, he could not know whether every official around him was completely loyal, but he could choose how his room smelled. He could choose the softness of his garments. He could allow the warmth of scented oil to settle into his skin. For a few moments, this was enough. The attendants might also prepare the emperor's hair. Combs could pass slowly through it. A servant might carefully arrange it according to the emperor's preference. The process was practical, but it could also be calming. The quiet sound of the comb, the faint movement of fabric, the gentle glow of lamps, the room becoming increasingly still, yet there was something else hidden within these luxurious fragrances. They reminded the emperor of the enormous world beyond the palace. Every rare ingredient had traveled. Someone had harvested it. Someone had transported it. Someone had sold it. Somewhere, far from Rome. Ordinary people had worked to produce the comforts enjoyed by a single person in an imperial bedroom. The emperor might never have thought about those distant hands, but the fragrance connected his private night to the entire empire, a world of farms, ships, merchants, ports, roads, and markets, all of it condensed into a small vessel of scented oil. Eventually, the servant would close the container, the perfume would remain in the air, the emperor would be ready for the next stage of the evening. But relaxation did not necessarily mean an empty stomach. Roman dining customs could extend well into the evening, especially among the wealthy, and sometimes, the final meal of the day was not a simple supper. It could be a long and leisurely affair filled with food, wine, conversation, and perhaps one more unexpected danger, because for an emperor, even dinner could be part of the strange journey toward sleep. The fragrance of oil still lingers in the imperial chamber, but somewhere beyond the bedroom, another part of the palace has begun to stir. A servant walks quietly through a corridor carrying a covered dish, another follows with a bronze lamp. The smell arrives before the people do. Warm bread, roasted meat, herbs, honey, perhaps the sharp sweetness of wine. The emperor may have finished bathing. His body may be clean, his hair carefully arranged, and his skin scented with expensive oils, but the night is not necessarily over, because in the world of Roman luxury, dinner could be a surprisingly long affair. For ordinary Romans, the evening meal was often a practical part of daily life. But among the wealthy, dining could become an experience in itself. The meal might stretch across hours. Conversation could continue long after the first dishes had been cleared. Wine could flow slowly, guests could recline comfortably while servants moved silently between them, and for an emperor, the scale of such an evening could be extraordinary. Yet tonight, we are not entering one of the enormous public banquets remembered in stories of imperial excess. We are following the emperor into a quieter meal. Perhaps there are only a few trusted people nearby. Perhaps the emperor is dining with family. Perhaps he has chosen to eat alone. Whatever the arrangement, the atmosphere is different from the formal meals of the day. The palace is darker now. The corridors are nearly empty, the lamps burn lower, and the meal feels less like a public performance. Still, there are rituals. Food arrives in courses. Servants carry dishes carefully. A cup is filled, another is removed. Plates are replaced. The emperor eats slowly. The Romans enjoyed a wide variety of foods, especially those available to the wealthy through the empire's extensive trade networks: olives, figs, dates, fish, poultry, cheeses, grains, vegetables, meats. Prepared with herbs and sauces, some foods that would have been rare in one part of the Mediterranean could be brought from another. The imperial table was therefore a quiet demonstration of the empire's reach. A single meal could bring together ingredients from distant landscapes, but beneath this abundance was a practical problem. The later the meal continued, the less likely sleep became. For a person preparing for bed, a heavy meal could make the body feel uncomfortable. The Romans themselves understood that eating habits affected the body, although their explanations came from ancient medical theories rather than modern science. Physicians often considered digestion an important part of health. The balance of food, drink, rest, and bodily activity was believed to influence a person's condition. For an emperor, whose health could affect the stability of the empire, these matters were not entirely trivial. A physician might advise moderation, or perhaps not. Roman emperors were not always famous for restraint. Some rulers became associated with extravagant banquets and enormous appetites. Others preferred simplicity. Personal habits varied enormously from one emperor to another. And that is part of what makes the private evenings so fascinating. There was no single imperial bedtime ritual. Each emperor brought his own personality into the night. One might enjoy an elaborate supper, another might prefer a light meal, one might drink heavily, another might avoid wine, one might continue talking until midnight, another might dismiss everyone early. Yet regardless of personality, the meal carried one unavoidable reality: the emperor had to trust the people around him. Every dish had passed through several hands, every cup had been poured by someone, every servant had entered the room carrying something, and the emperor knew that the more people involved in his private life, the more difficult it became to know everyone completely. This did not mean that every emperor lived in constant terror. Most nights were probably ordinary, most servants performed their duties without betrayal, most meals ended peacefully, but the possibility of danger was always somewhere in the background of Roman political life. Perhaps that is why the quietest moments can feel so revealing. Imagine the emperor lifting a cup. The room is warm, the food is slowly disappearing. A servant stands nearby. Outside, a guard watches the corridor. The emperor takes a sip. And for a moment, nothing happens, nothing at all. Just another evening, just another meal. And perhaps that was the strange thing about imperial fear. It could not be lived every moment. Life had to continue. People still had to eat. They still became hungry. They still became tired. They still wanted the comfort of familiar food at the end of a long day. Eventually, the final dish would be removed. The last cup would be set down. The emperor might lean back, feeling the weight of the meal settle within him. The room would become quieter, and gradually, the palace would return to its nighttime rhythm. But the emperor would not be left entirely alone. as the servants cleared away the remains of dinner. A small group of people would remain essential to the emperor's private world. They knew his habits, they knew his preferences, they knew when he wished to be disturbed, and when he wanted silence. These were the people who stood closest to the emperor when the rest of Rome disappeared into sleep, and in the darkness of the imperial palace, their loyalty could be worth more than gold. The final dishes have disappeared, the cups have been carried away, and somewhere in the palace, a door closes softly. The emperor's evening meal is over. Now, as the night settles more deeply over Rome, the circle of people around him becomes smaller. The crowds are gone, the officials have departed, the senators are no longer waiting. The palace that seemed so busy during the day has become a quieter place, but the emperor is not alone. A handful of people remain. They are the servants who belong to the private world of the ruler. To modern eyes, the word servant might suggest someone with a simple role, but inside an imperial palace, the reality could be far more complicated. Some attendants were responsible for clothing, others helped with bathing, some managed personal possessions, others carried messages, prepared rooms, or assisted with meals. Certain servants might have been trusted with intimate tasks that few other people were permitted to witness. The closer a servant stood to the emperor, the more valuable that position could become, and sometimes, the more dangerous. Imagine a young attendant entering the emperor's bedroom late at night. He carries nothing dramatic, perhaps only a folded garment, a small lamp, a cup of water. He approaches quietly. The emperor may already be resting. The servant places the object where it belongs. Then he waits. Perhaps the emperor asks for something, perhaps he says nothing. The servant leaves. A moment like this might seem insignificant, but in the world of imperial Rome, proximity was power. A person who could enter the emperor's private room might hear conversations that were never intended for public ears. He might know the emperor's habits. He might recognize when the ruler was ill. He might discover which visitors were trusted. He could even become familiar with the emperor's fears. This knowledge could be valuable, and because of that, private servants were not always ordinary household workers. Some could rise to positions of influence. They might become intermediaries between the emperor and the outside world. Someone who could whisper into the emperor's ear at the right moment might influence a decision without ever appearing in a public meeting. The imperial palace was therefore filled with invisible pathways of power. A senator might have enormous political status, a general might command thousands of soldiers, but a servant standing quietly beside the emperor's bed could sometimes possess a different kind of influence. Access, that was the precious thing. Access to the ruler, access to his private thoughts, access to the hours when he was tired and less guarded. This is why the people who served an emperor personally had to be chosen with care. Trust could take years to build, and even then, absolute certainty was difficult. The emperor knew that every private conversation created another person who knew something. Every secret shared became a secret that could potentially travel. Yet the emperor also needed people. He could not dress himself for every ceremony. He could not prepare his own meals. He could not manage every detail of the enormous household surrounding him. He needed hands. He needed eyes. He needed people who understood the rhythm of his life. And perhaps most importantly, he needed someone nearby when he was sick, when he could not sleep, when he woke from a troubling dream, when he felt the sudden loneliness that sometimes comes with great power. The private servant might hear the emperor speak in a completely different voice than the one used before the Senate. A ruler who appeared confident during the day might become quiet at night. A man who had commanded others might ask for reassurance. A person who seemed almost untouchable in public could become deeply human in private, and the servants saw this transformation. They witnessed the emperor without the costume of power. without the ceremonial clothing, without the crowds, without the applause, just a tired man in a quiet room. That intimacy created an unusual relationship. The servant served the emperor, but the emperor depended upon the servant. For a few hours each night, the roles became strangely intertwined. The ruler needed the person who served him, and the person who served him understood that his own safety could depend upon the ruler's favor. So the nighttime palace was built upon a delicate balance: trust, dependence, silence, and constant observation. As the hours passed, the servants would gradually reduce their movements. The room would become still. One by one, unnecessary attendants would disappear into the corridors. But some would remain. They would wait nearby, ready to answer if the emperor called, and beyond them, another group would take responsibility for the night. Their presence would be less intimate, less personal, but perhaps even more important, because while the servants watched over the emperor's comfort, someone else had to watch over his life. Outside the bedroom doors, footsteps would continue through the darkness. The guards were still awake. And they were not sleeping anywhere far away. The servants have grown quieter now. The emperor's private chamber is almost still. Only a few trusted attendants remain nearby, moving softly when needed, careful not to disturb the fragile silence that settles over the palace after midnight. But beyond the bedroom, someone else is awake, a guard, and he is not far away. In fact, for an emperor, the distance between a sleeping body and an armed protector could be surprisingly small. The reason was simple: a ruler who controlled enormous territories could never completely forget how vulnerable he became when he closed his eyes. During the day, the emperor could surround himself with officials, soldiers, and attendants. At night, his position changed. He lay down, he became still, he could not easily respond to danger, and for several hours, someone else had to remain alert. This was one of the strange contradictions of imperial power. The more important the emperor became, the more carefully his sleep had to be protected. The men responsible for that protection belonged to the military and security structures surrounding the imperial household. Among the most famous were the Praetorian Guard, an elite force closely associated with the protection of Roman emperors. Their history, however, was complicated. They were created to protect the emperor and his household, but over time, their political influence could become enormous. This created a relationship that was both reassuring and unsettling. The emperor needed his guards. He also had to be careful about the power they possessed. Still, on an ordinary night, the men stationed near the imperial residence were not thinking about history. They were simply doing their duty. Imagine one of them standing at the end of a corridor. The palace is silent. His armor is heavy. His weapon rests within reach. A small lamp burns nearby. He has been awake for hours. Perhaps his feet ache. Perhaps he is tired. But he cannot simply lie down, not while the emperor sleeps. The guard's role was not necessarily to stare continuously at one closed door. Security could involve controlling entrances, watching corridors, and making sure that unexpected visitors did not approach the private areas of the palace. A sleeping emperor required a protected environment, and that meant controlling movement. The night could be peaceful, but peace depended upon vigilance. Every sound might be ordinary: a servant returning from another room, a door opening, a sandal touching stone, a distant cough, the quiet movement of someone carrying water. Most of these sounds meant nothing, but the guard could not assume that every sound meant nothing. That was the burden of his position. He had to listen, and perhaps this is where the nighttime palace becomes strangely atmospheric. Imagine being awake while everyone else sleeps. The lamps are low, the corridors are long, the shadows seem deeper than they did during the day. Every few moments, the silence changes slightly. A distant footstep, Then nothing, the sound of fabric moving behind a door. Then silence again. For the emperor, this vigilance might provide reassurance. Knowing that armed men were nearby could make sleep easier, but it could also serve as a reminder of danger. Why were these guards necessary? Why did the emperor need protection while sleeping? The very presence of the guard carried an uncomfortable message. The palace was safe because it was being guarded, and if it required guarding, then perhaps it was never completely safe. This tension was part of imperial life. Protection and fear existed together. The emperor could sleep because someone else remained awake, but the person watching over him could never fully relax. The relationship between ruler and guard was also deeply personal. A guard might protect the emperor for years. He might see the ruler during ceremonies, military occasions, and private moments. He might recognize the emperor's voice from a distant room. He might know which doors opened at which hours. He might even become familiar with the habits of the entire household. In such a world, loyalty was enormously valuable, but history reminds us that loyalty could change. The same soldiers who protected emperors could sometimes become powerful political actors. That possibility gave the imperial knight another layer of uncertainty. A guard outside the bedroom was a source of safety, but he was also a human being, and human beings could have ambitions. So the emperor slept in a carefully protected room, surrounded by people whose presence was meant to keep him alive. The servants protected his comfort, the physicians protected his health, and the soldiers protected the doors. But there was another kind of protection that no guard could provide: protection from the unseen. Because once the emperor closed his eyes, his mind entered a world where weapons could not follow, a world of dreams, a world where gods could speak, where dead relatives might return, where strange symbols could appear, and where a single frightening image might be remembered as a warning. So while the guards remained awake outside, the emperor entered another kind of night watch, the watch of dreams. The guard remains outside, his footsteps are quiet, the corridor is still, and behind the closed doors, the emperor has finally surrendered to sleep. For a while, there is nothing to hear, no requests from servants, no distant voices, no movement through the palace, only breathing, and the gentle flicker of a dying lamp. But in the ancient Roman imagination, sleep did not necessarily mean that the world had become silent. It meant something else. The mind had entered a place where strange things could happen, a place where the living might meet the dead, where gods could appear, where the future might briefly reveal itself. For Roman emperors, dreams could carry a special weight. The ruler of Rome was not simply another citizen. His actions affected millions of lives. His decisions could change laws, armies, taxes, and the fortunes of entire provinces. So if an emperor dreamed of something unusual, people might pay attention, very close attention. Imagine the emperor waking suddenly in the darkness, his eyes open. For a moment, he does not know where he is. The room is quiet. The curtains are still. The lamp has almost gone out. Then the memory returns. A dream. Perhaps he saw a familiar face, perhaps a strange animal, perhaps a battlefield, perhaps a temple, perhaps he saw himself falling from a great height. The dream itself may have lasted only a few moments. But now it is awake inside his mind. What did it mean? To modern people, dreams can feel like strange stories created by the sleeping brain. But ancient Romans often approached them differently. Dreams could be interpreted as messages. Some were believed to come from the gods, others might be warnings, others could be meaningless. The difficulty was knowing which was which, and that uncertainty created a world of professional interpreters, priests, and advisors who could be asked to explain mysterious signs. The emperor might describe his dream to someone he trusted. Perhaps the interpreter would listen carefully, Then questions would begin. What did you see? Where were you standing? Who appeared? What happened first? What happened at the end? The smallest details could be considered important. A dream was not necessarily understood as a simple story. It could be a puzzle, and the emperor's task was to discover its meaning. But dreams were only one part of Roman superstition. The waking world was also filled with signs. A bird flying across the wrong path, a strange sound in the night, a sudden illness, a lightning strike, an unusual event during a religious ceremony, any of these could attract attention. The Romans lived in a world where the divine and human realms were thought to be closely connected. The gods might communicate through signs. The challenge was learning how to read them. For an emperor, this could become particularly important. The emperor had religious responsibilities as well as political ones. His relationship with the gods was considered important to the stability of Rome itself, so an unsettling omen might not be ignored. It might be discussed, it might be investigated. Sometimes, rituals could be performed in response, and this meant that the emperor's nighttime life was influenced by beliefs that extended far beyond the bedroom. The night itself could feel mysterious. Darkness made ordinary objects difficult to recognize. A sound could seem closer than it was. A shadow might resemble a person. The movement of curtains could look like something alive. In such an environment, imagination could easily fill the gaps left by uncertainty. And perhaps this is why the Roman night was so rich in superstition. When the world became difficult to see, people became more willing to believe that unseen forces were present. Even emperors, despite their immense authority, were not immune to this feeling. They might command soldiers, they might control provinces, they might possess fortunes beyond imagination, but they could not command a dream to stop. They could not order a disturbing omen to disappear. They could not force the gods to speak clearly. And perhaps that was one of the most unsettling parts of sleep. The emperor could control almost everything around him until he closed his eyes. Then he entered a world where power had different rules. A dream could leave him frightened. An omen could make him cautious. A priest's interpretation could change the mood of an entire day. And sometimes, the fear created by these beliefs could become so strong that people searched for ways to influence sleep itself. Ancient medicine offered many possibilities: herbs, potions, preparations, remedies intended to calm the body or encourage rest. Some might have been harmless, others could be dangerous, and in the private world of the emperor, even sleep itself could become something carefully managed. The guards were watching the doors, the priests were watching the signs. And somewhere nearby, a physician might be preparing something meant to help the emperor finally rest. The dream has faded, but its feeling remains. The emperor lies quietly beneath the blankets, perhaps still thinking about what he saw while sleeping. Outside, the guards continue their silent watch. Somewhere in another part of the palace, a servant moves carefully through a corridor. The night continues, and yet sleep does not always come easily. For an ordinary Roman, a restless night might simply mean turning over on a hard mattress and waiting for morning. For an emperor, however, there were people who could be summoned: physicians, healers, attendants familiar with the body's smallest complaints. If the emperor could not sleep, someone might be asked to help. Roman medicine was a mixture of observation, inherited knowledge, philosophy, religion, and ideas that can seem unusual to us today. Some treatments were sensible, others were based on theories that would later be abandoned, and among the many remedies used in the ancient world were substances believed to calm the body and encourage sleep. The Roman physician might begin not with medicine, but with questions. Had the emperor eaten too much? Was his digestion troubled? Was he overheated? Was he anxious? Had he spent too much time working? Was his mind disturbed by some recent event? Ancient physicians believed that the body and mind were deeply connected. A problem in one could affect the other, so sleep might be encouraged through changes in food, bathing, exercise, or daily habits. Sometimes, however, stronger remedies were considered. Plants and herbs had been used for centuries as medicines. Some were believed to have calming properties. Certain preparations might be taken as drinks, others could be applied to the body. Some fragrant substances might be burned or placed near the bed. The ancient world was filled with plants that people believed could influence sleep, pain, digestion, or mood. But not every remedy was safe. The difference between medicine and poison could be surprisingly small. A substance that seemed helpful in one amount could become dangerous in another. This was especially important in an imperial household. The emperor's physicians were dealing with a person whose health had enormous political importance. If the ruler became seriously ill, the consequences could spread far beyond the bedroom. So a physician had to balance two responsibilities. He had to help the emperor, and he had to avoid making things worse. Imagine the scene. It is late. The emperor has been unable to sleep. A physician enters quietly. He carries a small container. Perhaps inside is a preparation intended to calm the body. The emperor listens. The physician explains how much should be taken. The room is warm. The lamps are low. Everyone is waiting for the medicine to work. But the emperor may have another concern. What exactly is inside the container? This question would have been especially uncomfortable in a world where political assassination was a familiar fear. A medicine was supposed to heal, but anything placed inside the body could potentially harm. The physician therefore occupied a position of enormous trust. He had access to the emperor. He understood the ruler's health. He might know weaknesses that no one else knew, and he could provide substances that others could not easily identify. Most physicians, of course, were not conspirators. They were professionals attempting to treat illness with the knowledge available to them. But the possibility of betrayal existed in the imagination of Roman politics. This made nighttime medicine particularly delicate. The emperor needed help sleeping, yet even the act of accepting help required trust. There were also gentler methods. The warmth of a bath, a comfortable bed, a quiet room, a soothing fragrance, perhaps a light meal rather than an enormous one, maybe a little wine, perhaps conversation with someone trusted. These could all be part of preparing the body for rest. The most successful remedy might not have been a mysterious potion at all. It might simply have been routine, a familiar sequence of actions that told the body, the day is finished, you are safe, you can rest. Yet the Roman world was not always so peaceful. Pain, illness, anxiety, and fear could interrupt even the most carefully prepared evening, and when they did, the emperor's physician might be called again. The bedroom could suddenly become a place of medical attention. A lamp might be raised, a servant might bring water, a physician might examine the emperor's face or breathing. The quiet ritual of bedtime would be interrupted. For a ruler whose life was constantly protected, the human body remained stubbornly unpredictable. No amount of wealth could guarantee perfect sleep, no palace could prevent illness entirely, and no medicine could promise that tomorrow would arrive safely. So eventually, the physician would leave, the lamp would burn lower. The emperor would close his eyes once again. Perhaps the remedy would work, perhaps sleep would finally come, and while the ruler rested, the palace would continue its silent work. Doors would remain guarded, corridors would be watched, and the men responsible for security would still be listening, because medicine could calm the emperor's body, but only vigilance could protect the palace around him. And as the night moved deeper toward its darkest hour, the security of the imperial residence would become even more important. The physician has finally gone. The medicine rests quietly on the table. The emperor lies beneath the coverings, perhaps beginning to feel the heaviness of sleep returning, but outside the bedroom, the palace remains awake, the lamps burn along the corridors, the guards stand at their posts, and somewhere beyond the private chambers, doors are being checked, entrances watched, and quiet movements noticed. Because an imperial palace at night was never simply a place where everyone went to sleep, it was a carefully controlled environment. The Roman emperor might be resting, but the machinery of protection continued without pause. During the day, the palace was filled with movement. Officials arrived, servants carried messages, visitors waited, soldiers came and went. The emperor's household could feel almost like a small city at night. However, the number of people allowed to move freely through this world became much smaller. This was partly a matter of security. If everyone could wander through the palace after midnight, there would be no easy way to know who belonged there, so the night required boundaries. Some doors were closed. Some corridors became restricted. Certain entrances were guarded. People who needed to move through the palace had to be recognized. The guards were not simply protecting one room, they were controlling a network of spaces. The emperor's bedroom, the surrounding corridors, the private gardens, the entrances to the residence, the areas where servants slept, the places where important documents or valuable objects might be kept. Every part of the palace had its own vulnerabilities, and every vulnerability required attention. Imagine walking through the imperial residence after midnight. Your sandals make a faint sound against the stone floor. The corridor ahead appears empty. Then, as you approach a doorway, a guard steps forward. He asks who you are, you explain. Perhaps he recognizes you. Perhaps another servant confirms your identity. Only then are you permitted to continue. This might seem excessive, but in an imperial household, knowing who was present could be extremely important. The emperor's safety depended partly on controlling access. The fewer unexpected people who could approach the ruler, the fewer opportunities there were for danger. Yet security was not only about enemies, fire was another concern. Ancient Roman cities were vulnerable to fire, especially in crowded areas. Inside a palace filled with lamps, oil, wooden objects, fabrics, and other flammable materials, care was necessary. A single unattended flame could become a serious problem, so the nighttime staff had another responsibility: watching the lamps, ensuring that dangerous flames were not left where they could cause trouble, keeping the palace functioning while everyone else slept. Even the lighting itself had to be managed. Oil lamps did not burn forever. They needed fuel, they needed attention, and they could produce smoke. A servant might pass through the corridors to check them. Perhaps one lamp was burning too brightly, another was beginning to fade. The palace was therefore never completely dark. But neither was it brightly illuminated. Instead, it existed in layers of shadow and warm light. One corridor might glow softly, the next might be almost black. A doorway could appear mysterious until someone carrying a lamp passed through it. Then, suddenly, the darkness would retreat. This changing landscape created an unusual atmosphere. The palace seemed larger at night. Rooms that had felt familiar during the day could appear strange after sunset. A statue illuminated from one side might cast an enormous shadow. A curtain moving in the breeze could look like a person. A distant sound could travel through the stone corridors and seem to come from somewhere much closer. The guards were trained to remain attentive, but they were human. They became tired. They grew cold. They wanted to sit down. They wanted the night to end, yet their duty continued. And perhaps this is the hidden story of imperial security. It was built from ordinary people doing repetitive things, standing, walking, listening, checking, waiting. There was nothing glamorous about it, no great battle, no heroic charge. Just the slow passage of hours. One guard might glance toward the emperor's door, another might look down an empty corridor, a servant might carry a lamp from one room to another, and somewhere inside the palace, the emperor would sleep, or perhaps he would not, because even the safest palace could not guarantee peace of mind. The walls might be thick, the doors might be guarded, the corridors might be watched. But the emperor still knew that somewhere beyond those protections was a world of people he could not completely control, and inside his bedroom, another reminder of his extraordinary position waited around him: luxury, not ordinary comfort, not simply a bed and a blanket, but an environment designed to surround the emperor with beauty, softness, and wealth. The sleeping chamber itself could become a symbol of the empire, and as the guards continued their watch outside, we now return to the room where the emperor rested, because behind those carefully protected doors was a bedroom unlike almost any other in the Roman world. The palace has grown almost completely silent. Beyond the private chamber, guards continue their slow watch. Lamps burn along distant corridors, and servants move only when their duties require it. But inside, the emperor's world has become softer. This is the room where the ruler of Rome finally disappears from public view. No senators, no petitioners, no crowds, only the quiet space surrounding the bed. And for an emperor, that space could be extraordinary. The imperial bedroom was not simply a place for sleeping. It could be a carefully designed expression of wealth, power, taste, and personal identity. Every detail had meaning: the walls, the furniture, the fabrics, the objects placed nearby, even the arrangement of light. Imagine entering such a room late at night. Your eyes adjust slowly. The first thing you notice is the marble. Perhaps pale stone covers the floor. Perhaps columns rise along the walls. There may be painted decorations inspired by mythology, nature, or scenes from the Roman world. The colors are softened by darkness. During the day, the room might appear bright and impressive, but at night, under the warm glow of oil lamps, everything changes. Gold becomes darker, marble becomes warmer, painted figures seem to disappear into shadow. The room feels less like a public monument and more like a private dream. The bed itself would be the central object. Roman beds varied considerably according to wealth and social position. For an emperor, however, there was little reason to accept anything ordinary. Fine fabrics could cover the sleeping area. Decorative details might surround the frame. Soft materials could make the bed more comfortable than those available to most Romans. The coverings might be embroidered, the pillows carefully arranged. Everything designed to create an impression of effortless luxury. Yet even here, the reality of ancient life remained. There were no modern mattresses, no electric heating, no silent mechanical systems controlling temperature. Comfort depended upon materials, architecture, servants, and the climate. A room could become too warm or too cold. A draft might pass through an opening. The emperor's attendants had to respond. Perhaps curtains were adjusted. Perhaps a covering was added. Perhaps a lamp was moved. The luxury of the imperial bedroom was therefore not entirely passive. It required maintenance. Someone had to create comfort, someone had to preserve it, someone had to notice when something was wrong, and this created another fascinating contradiction. The emperor possessed the finest surroundings that wealth could provide, yet his comfort depended upon other people. A servant arranged the bed, another maintained the lamps, someone prepared the clothing, someone brought water, someone watched the door. The emperor's private world was therefore filled with invisible labor. The luxury seemed effortless only because many people worked behind the scenes. There might also be objects of personal importance. A small statue, a family possession, a religious symbol, a letter, perhaps something that reminded the emperor of home. Even the most powerful ruler could surround himself with objects that carried emotional meaning. Because a bedroom is not only a place where the body rests, it is where memories remain, and an emperor's memories could be complicated. The walls might remind him of victories, but they might also remind him of people who had died. The objects might represent family, but imperial families were often tangled in rivalries, marriages, and political suspicion. A luxurious room could therefore hold both comfort and sadness. Perhaps this is why the nighttime bedroom feels so different from the public spaces of Rome. In the Forum, power was displayed; in the Senate, authority was debated; in the palace's ceremonial rooms, status was performed. But here, the emperor could simply lie down. The room did not ask him to speak, it did not ask him to command, it did not ask him to prove anything. For a few hours, the imperial bedroom could become a shelter from the enormous responsibility of being emperor, and perhaps that was the greatest luxury of all: not gold, not marble, not expensive fabrics, but silence, a room where the world could temporarily be kept outside. Of course, that silence had limits. The guards were still there, the servants were still nearby, and the emperor knew that the palace was protected because his life was considered too valuable to leave unguarded. So even in the most luxurious bedroom in Rome, the shadow of vulnerability remained. The emperor could surround himself with beauty, he could soften the bed with the finest fabrics, he could fill the room with perfume, but none of these things could completely erase one simple truth. He was asleep, and sleeping meant surrendering control. Perhaps that is why the emperor's bedroom was both the safest place in the palace and the place where he was most exposed. The guards outside could protect the doors. The servants could protect his comfort, the physicians could protect his health, but while he slept, he could not protect himself, and as the lamps burn lower, that thought begins to linger in the darkness, because the greatest danger to an emperor might not come while he was awake, it might come when he closed his eyes. The emperor lies quietly beneath the rich coverings, the lamps have been turned lower, the room is warm, the palace beyond the door has settled into its deepest silence, and yet, somewhere in the darkness, an uncomfortable thought remains. What if someone came for him while he slept? It is a simple question, but for a Roman emperor, it could be terrifying, because history had already shown that the imperial throne was not always a safe place to sit. The Roman Empire had been ruled by men who lived surrounded by power, and some of those men had died because of it. The danger was not always obvious. It might come from an enemy standing outside the empire, or from a political rival inside Rome. But sometimes, it could come from someone who had once been trusted, a colleague, a relative, a soldier, a servant, someone who knew the palace, someone who knew the routines, someone who knew exactly when the emperor would be most vulnerable, and there was perhaps no moment more vulnerable than sleep. During the day, an emperor could move through carefully controlled spaces, he could be surrounded by guards, he could command his household. He could respond to threats. At night, everything changed. He closed his eyes, he became still, his attention disappeared inward. For several hours, he could not personally watch the people around him. This is why the idea of assassination while sleeping carried such a particular horror. It required no battlefield, no army, no public confrontation, only opportunity. The night continues, and for a moment, the fear of betrayal fades into the background. No footsteps approach the emperor's door, no unfamiliar voice disturbs the corridor. The guards remain at their posts, the lamps continue to burn, but inside the private chamber, another kind of vigilance is possible. The emperor's body, because even the most carefully protected ruler could become ill, a headache, a fever, a sudden pain, a troubled stomach, a sleepless mind. These were dangers that could not be stopped by soldiers standing outside the door, and this was where the imperial physician entered the story. The doctor who served an emperor held an unusual position. He was not simply treating a wealthy patient. He was caring for a person whose health could affect the entire Roman world. If an emperor became seriously ill, political uncertainty could spread quickly. Officials might begin wondering who would rule next. Military commanders might become anxious. Rival factions could begin forming. Even a private illness could have public consequences. So nighttime medical care was not always a minor household matter. Sometimes it was part of protecting the stability of the empire itself. Imagine a quiet bedroom. The emperor has been asleep for several hours. Suddenly, he wakes. Something feels wrong. Perhaps his head aches. Perhaps he feels unusually warm. He calls for someone. The servant responds. A lamp is raised. The room changes instantly. What had been a peaceful sleeping chamber becomes a place of observation. The physician is summoned. He arrives quietly. There is no dramatic entrance, no shouting. Just a tired doctor stepping into a room where the most important patient in the empire is waiting. The physician begins with simple observations. He may look at the emperor's face. He may ask about pain. He may examine the body according to the medical knowledge of the time. Ancient physicians did not possess modern laboratories, advanced imaging, or antibiotics, but they did have experience. They watched, they listened. They compared symptoms, they tried to understand patterns. Roman medicine was influenced heavily by Greek medical traditions, especially the ideas associated with Hippocrates and later medical writers. Many physicians believed that health depended upon balance within the body. They paid attention to diet, digestion, sleep, exercise, the seasons, the environment, and the general habits of the patient. For an emperor, these observations could be particularly detailed. The physician might know what the ruler usually ate, how much he drank, how often he exercised, how well he slept, whether he had suffered from similar problems before. The physician therefore became another person who knew the emperor intimately. Perhaps not emotionally, but physically. He knew the weaknesses hidden beneath the public image of strength. He knew which illnesses had troubled the ruler in the past. He might know that the emperor suffered from headaches, or digestive problems, or recurring fevers, or anxiety. Such knowledge was valuable, and perhaps a little dangerous, because the physician could see the emperor without the protective mask of power. A senator might see an invincible ruler. A physician might see a tired man with a persistent cough. A general might see a commander. A doctor might see someone whose body was failing. This difference made medical care deeply personal. The physician might recommend rest, perhaps a change in food, perhaps a bath, perhaps herbs or other treatments. Sometimes, the remedy could be simple. The emperor might be told to drink water, to avoid certain foods, to remain warm, to sleep, and sometimes, the physician could do very little. That was the hardest reality of ancient medicine. There were illnesses that could not be cured. There were infections that could not be controlled. There were conditions that even wealth could not overcome, for an emperor accustomed to commanding others. This must have been a humbling experience. He could order a road to be built, a city to be repaired, an army to move, but he could not command a fever to disappear. He could not negotiate with pain. He could not decree that his body should remain healthy, and perhaps this is one reason nighttime illness could feel especially frightening. During the day, distractions were everywhere. At night, there was nothing to hide behind. The body became the center of attention. Every breath, every movement, every sensation. The physician might remain nearby until the emperor felt better. A servant might prepare water. Another might adjust the bedding. the lamp would continue burning. Outside, the guards would continue their watch, the palace would quietly adapt itself around the sick man, and eventually, perhaps, the emperor would begin to feel better, the physician would leave, the servant would lower the lamp, the room would return to silence, but the experience would leave behind a quiet reminder: the emperor was powerful, but he was not invulnerable, and perhaps, after such a night, the ruler might seek another kind of relief. Not medicine, not prayer, not protection, something lighter, something that could occupy the mind before sleep. The physician has disappeared into the sleeping palace, the emperor is feeling better, perhaps the discomfort has passed, perhaps the medicine has begun to work, or perhaps there was never anything seriously wrong at all. Whatever the reason, the room has returned to its earlier quietness, the lamps glow softly, the servants move with careful steps, the guards remain outside, and yet, sleep still has not arrived. For some Roman emperors, the mind could be more difficult to quiet than the body. After a long day of meetings, ceremonies, political decisions, and endless conversations, silence might not immediately feel peaceful. The mind continued moving, thoughts remained. Memories returned, worries waited, so sometimes, before sleep, the emperor might seek entertainment, not the enormous spectacles of the Colosseum, not the noise of a crowded theater, not a public celebration, something smaller, something private, something intended to occupy the mind for a little while longer. Perhaps there was music. A musician might sit nearby and play a quiet melody on a lyre or another instrument. The sound would travel gently through the chamber, the strings would vibrate, the notes would rise and disappear. There would be no applause, no cheering crowd, only the music. For a ruler accustomed to the noise of public life, this kind of performance could feel deeply personal. The musician might know exactly how softly to play, the emperor might listen with his eyes closed. Perhaps the music would continue for several minutes, perhaps much longer. The purpose was not necessarily excitement, it was distraction. The mind needed somewhere else to go, and music provided that place. But entertainment could take many forms. A storyteller might be invited into the chamber. Roman society had a rich tradition of storytelling, poetry, and recitation. A skilled performer could transform a quiet room simply by speaking. The emperor might listen to stories about heroes, myths about gods, tales of distant lands, poetry written by famous authors. Perhaps a familiar story was chosen because the emperor already knew how it ended. There could be comfort in that. The world outside was unpredictable, politics were uncertain, the future was hidden, but inside a story, the ending was already known, and perhaps this was one reason storytelling worked so well at night. It gave the mind a safe journey, a beginning, a middle, an ending, then silence. Sometimes, however, entertainment could be more personal. The emperor might speak with a trusted companion, a friend, a family member. Someone who could talk without the formal language required. In public, the conversation might wander. They could discuss ordinary things, the weather, the palace, a memory from childhood, a strange rumor, a story heard earlier in the day. These conversations might seem insignificant, but for an emperor, they could be precious. The person sitting nearby was not necessarily asking for a political favor, not requesting money, not seeking influence. They were simply present, and sometimes, simple presence was enough. The Roman world also valued poetry. Verses could be recited aloud while guests listened, a poem about love, nature, the gods, death, fate, the changing seasons. At night, such subjects could feel different. A poem about mortality might seem more powerful when spoken in a quiet bedroom. The emperor, surrounded by luxury, might hear words reminding him that all human lives eventually end, even rulers, even conquerors, even men whose statues stood across the empire. Perhaps such thoughts were comforting, perhaps they were unsettling. It depended upon the emperor. Entertainment could also become a form of escape. For a short time, the ruler could forget that he was being watched, forget that decisions waited for morning, forget the enormous responsibilities attached to his title. He could simply listen. And slowly, the night could begin to soften. The voice of the storyteller might become quieter, the musician might play more slowly, the conversation might fade into comfortable silence, the emperor's eyes might begin to close. But there was something fascinating about this moment. The emperor's bedtime was not always about preparing the body for sleep. Sometimes, it was about persuading the mind to let go. And perhaps this is something people have always understood. When we cannot sleep, we look for something gentle, a familiar voice, a quiet story, a piece of music. Something that gives the mind a place to rest. The Roman emperor was no different. His palace was larger, his bed was richer, his servants were more numerous, but the restless mind remained the same. Eventually, the entertainment would end, the final note would disappear, the storyteller would fall silent, the companion would leave, the room would become still once again, and this time, perhaps, sleep would finally come. But not every emperor was so fortunate. Some nights, even music could not quiet the mind. Some thoughts refused to disappear. Some worries returned again and again. And for certain rulers, the hours before dawn became long, lonely stretches of wakefulness. The palace might be silent, but the emperor would remain awake, and in those sleepless hours, the strange relationship between power and rest would become impossible to ignore. The music has ended, the storyteller has gone, the last quiet conversation has faded into the corridors, and now, once again, the emperor is alone with the night. The chamber is peaceful, the bed is comfortable, the lamps are low, everything has been arranged for sleep, and yet, sleep does not always obey. For some Roman emperors, the hours of darkness could become strangely long. The body might be tired, the mind was not. One thought appeared. Then another, a decision from the previous day, a political problem waiting for tomorrow, a disagreement with a trusted official, a rumor that refused to disappear. The emperor might close his eyes, then open them again. The palace clock, if we imagine the passing of time through the changing lamps and the movement of the night, seems to move painfully slowly. This was one of the hidden costs of absolute power. The emperor could command thousands of people, but he could not command himself to fall asleep. There are many reasons a person might lie awake: pain, illness, anxiety, excessive food, too much wine, an unfamiliar bed, a troubled conscience, or simply the natural restlessness that visits human beings without explanation. For emperors, however, there was an additional burden, responsibility. The empire never truly disappeared. Even when the emperor closed his eyes, provinces continued to exist. Armies remained stationed along distant borders, officials continued making decisions, ships crossed the Mediterranean, messages traveled along Roman roads. Somewhere, people were waiting for instructions from Rome. The emperor could not personally think about all of it, but he knew it was there, and sometimes, knowing that the world was waiting could make sleep more difficult. Imagine the emperor turning slightly beneath the blankets. He listens. Nothing. He closes his eyes. A few moments pass. Then a thought returns. Perhaps he remembers a letter received earlier, a governor asking for help, a senator whose loyalty seems uncertain, a family member behaving strangely, a military commander gaining too much influence. The thought grows, then another follows. The emperor opens his eyes. The room is exactly as it was before, but his mind has changed. This is how a sleepless night can become its own kind of prison. There is nowhere to escape. The palace is too quiet. The darkness gives thought room to expand. A small concern can become enormous, and the more a person tries to force sleep, the further away it may seem. Roman writers sometimes described rulers as troubled by suspicion, anxiety, or fear. We should be careful about accepting every ancient story literally. Roman historians often wrote with political purposes. They wanted to praise some emperors and condemn others. They sometimes exaggerated behavior to make a moral point. Still, behind these stories is something believable. Power does not necessarily bring peace. In fact, it can create new forms of worry. A private citizen may worry about feeding a family. A soldier may worry about survival. An emperor may worry about everyone. And perhaps the most difficult part is that there is no simple solution if the emperor trusts everyone. He may become vulnerable if he trusts no one. He may become isolated if he ignores every rumor. He may miss a real threat if he believes every rumor. He may never rest. The night magnifies this dilemma. During daylight, the emperor could distract himself with activity. At night, there was nothing left to do. Only wait. Sometimes, a sleepless emperor might call for a servant. Perhaps he wanted water. Perhaps he wanted the lamps adjusted. Perhaps he simply wanted someone nearby. This was another strange aspect of imperial life. Even loneliness could be managed by servants. If the emperor wanted company, someone could be summoned. But that did not necessarily mean the emperor felt less alone. A servant could stand nearby. A guard could watch the door. A musician could play. A physician could offer advice. Yet none of them could enter the emperor's mind. No one could remove the thoughts keeping him awake. Eventually, the night would begin to change. The darkness would become slightly less complete. The lamps would seem less necessary. Somewhere outside, the first signs of morning would approach. The emperor might finally fall asleep, just as the world was preparing to wake, and that created another problem. A sleepless night could steal part of the following day. The emperor might rise late, or he might wake exhausted. Perhaps meetings would be delayed. Perhaps decisions would be made with a tired mind. The private experience of insomnia could therefore become part of public history. A ruler who had spent the night awake still had to rule in the morning. The empire did not care whether he had slept. The petition still arrived. The officials still waited. The responsibilities remained. And so, as the final darkness begins to thin, the emperor's sleepless night approaches its uncertain ending. Perhaps sleep has finally arrived. Perhaps it never did. Either way, morning is coming, and before the first light touches the palace walls, there are still a few quiet moments left, moments when the emperor lies between night and day, waiting for the world to begin again. The long night is beginning to loosen its grip. The emperor may have slept, or perhaps he never truly did. Either way, something has changed. The darkness beyond the curtains is no longer complete. A faint grayness has appeared in the sky. The oil lamps that seemed necessary only an hour ago now appear almost unnecessary. One by one, they begin to fade, and throughout the palace, the first movements of morning begin. Before sunrise, there is a special kind of quiet. The day has not yet arrived, but the night is already leaving. For the emperor's household, this was the moment when the palace slowly shifted from private life back into public life. Servants began preparing. Guards remained attentive. Physicians might make their final rounds. The household was waking before the wider city. The emperor, however, did not necessarily rise immediately. His schedule could depend on his habits, his health, and his responsibilities. Some rulers might prefer to begin the day early. Others might remain in bed longer. A sleepless night could change everything. But even when the emperor was still resting, His household could already be preparing for what came next. A servant might quietly enter the bedroom, not loudly, never suddenly. The emperor's private space required careful manners. The servant might check whether the ruler was awake. Perhaps the curtains would be opened slightly, just enough to allow the first light inside. This transition from darkness to daylight could be almost ceremonial. The private world of the emperor was gradually being exposed to the morning. The bedroom, which had seemed mysterious during the night, now became visible again. The furniture, the fabrics, the marble, the objects placed around the room, everything returned to ordinary appearance. The night had made the palace feel enormous. Morning made it familiar again. Outside, Rome was beginning to stir. The city was never truly silent. Even before sunrise, there were sounds, people moving through streets, animals being led from one place to another, workers preparing for the day, doors opening, voices beginning to rise, the distant rhythm of ordinary life. The emperor might not hear all of this directly. The palace was designed to separate him from much of the city's noise. But the world outside was waiting, and soon the ruler would have to rejoin it. Before that happened, however, there were practical matters. The emperor's body had to be prepared for the day. Water might be brought, clothing would be arranged, the room might be refreshed, servants would begin removing the evidence of the night, a used lamp, a cup, a folded covering, perhaps a medicine container left from the previous evening. These objects told a quiet story. The emperor had slept, or tried to sleep. He had been cared for, he had been guarded, and now the night was over. The security arrangements also changed. The guards who had spent hours watching the palace could finally begin to relax. Their replacements might arrive. The night watch would gradually end. The men who had stood awake while others slept could finally step away from their posts. Perhaps they would eat, perhaps they would rest, perhaps another duty waited for them. But their work had been invisible. Most people would never know who had watched the corridor during the darkest hours. That was the nature of palace security. Success meant nothing happened, no intruder appeared, no alarm was raised, no danger reached the emperor. A quiet night was considered a successful night, and perhaps this is why the transition before sunrise is so interesting. Nothing dramatic happens, no battle, no assassination, no great announcement, just the slow movement of people returning to their daily roles. Yet beneath this ordinary rhythm lies something important. The emperor's private night is ending. Soon, he will no longer be simply a man lying in bed. He will become the emperor again. The distinction may seem small, but it was enormous. During the night, he could be tired, ill, afraid, restless, human. In the morning, the world would expect something different: authority, confidence, decisions, the ability to appear certain even when he was not. And perhaps, before sunrise, there was one final moment when the emperor could remain completely private. A few minutes between identities. The palace was waking, the guards were changing, the servants were preparing, the city was beginning to stir. But the emperor had not yet stepped into the day. Soon he would, and when he did, the strange rituals of the night would disappear behind the public image of imperial power. The man who had worried about sleep would become the ruler everyone expected to see. The doors would open, the attendants would gather, and the emperor's morning would begin. The first light has finally arrived. The night guards are stepping away from their posts. The servants are moving more confidently now. The palace is no longer hidden beneath darkness, and inside the private chamber, the emperor is waking. After a night of dreams, medicines, music, worries, and quiet protection, the moment has come when the ruler must return to the world. There is something strangely ordinary about this moment. No matter how powerful a person becomes, Morning still arrives, the body still needs to wake, the eyes still need to adjust to the light, and the first moments of the day can feel surprisingly private. For the emperor, however, waking was rarely a simple matter of opening his eyes and stepping out of bed. The household had to know when he was awake. Servants might wait nearby, attendants could begin preparing clothing, physicians might be available if the emperor had been unwell during the night. The day's schedule would also begin taking shape. But before all of that, there was the emperor himself. Perhaps he remained still for a few moments. Perhaps he remembered the night's dreams. Maybe he thought about the day ahead. Or perhaps, after a sleepless night, he simply wanted to remain in bed. The difference between a rested emperor and an exhausted one could be significant, but the empire did not pause for tiredness. Eventually, the emperor had to rise. The morning might begin with washing. Water was essential to Roman daily life. A servant could bring a basin or vessel. The emperor could wash his face and hands, preparing himself for the day. The simple act of washing carried a sense of transition. Night was finished, sleep was finished, the public day was beginning. Then came clothing. Roman clothing could communicate status very clearly. The emperor's garments were not merely practical, they helped create an image. The moment he entered public view, people needed to recognize his position, but before that public appearance, the clothing had to be prepared. Servants might arrange the garments carefully. They would ensure that everything looked appropriate. The emperor's appearance was part of his authority. A ruler who looked composed could inspire confidence. Even if he had spent half the night awake, the outside world might never know. This was one of the great performances of imperial life. The private man could be tired. The public emperor had to appear ready. After dressing, the emperor might eat. Breakfast habits varied greatly across Roman society, and the emperor's routine could change depending on personal preference. Perhaps he wanted something light, bread, fruit, a little cheese, something easy after the night's rest, or perhaps the previous evening's feast had been too heavy, and the morning meal was modest. Servants would prepare whatever was required. The emperor might eat alone, or he might receive a small number of trusted people. The palace was already becoming more active. Messages were arriving, officials were preparing. People who had waited through the night might soon request the emperor's attention. The private bedroom was gradually losing its purpose. It had been a place of sleep. Now, it was becoming the starting point of another day of rule. Perhaps the emperor would speak with a physician. If the previous night had been difficult, his health might need to be discussed. Perhaps the doctor would ask whether he had slept, whether the medicine had helped, whether the pain had returned. These small questions could influence the entire day. Then the emperor might receive information, news from Rome, reports from distant provinces, letters from officials, requests for decisions. The outside world entered the palace piece by piece, and with each message, the emperor became less private. More people would approach, more conversations would begin. The peaceful bedroom would slowly disappear behind the machinery of government. Yet there was often a moment of transition. The emperor might pause, perhaps near a window, perhaps beneath a column, perhaps looking out across the palace grounds. The city was fully awake now. Rome was beginning another ordinary day. Markets would open, workers would move, children would learn. Travelers would continue their journeys, and somewhere within all of this, the emperor was preparing to make decisions that might affect them. The contrast was enormous. The ordinary Roman lived an ordinary morning. The emperor lived a morning surrounded by consequences. But before he became the center of politics again, he was simply a man who had woken from sleep, perhaps tired, perhaps refreshed, perhaps troubled by a dream he could not remember clearly, and perhaps, for just one moment, He thought about the strange night that had passed, the guards, the physician, the music, the darkness, the dreams. Then the thought disappeared, the door opened, the attendants waited, the day had begun. And the emperor stepped forward, leaving the private world of his bedroom behind. The emperor has stepped into the morning, the bedroom is behind him now, the lamps are fading, the servants are preparing for another day, the guards have completed their night watch, and somewhere inside the palace, the bed remains exactly where it was, quiet, waiting. It is easy to imagine that everything important happened during the day, in the Senate, on the battlefield, in the crowded streets, inside grand public ceremonies, but sometimes, history was shaped by what happened when the world was asleep, a decision made at midnight, a dream remembered before dawn, a physician called into a private chamber, a trusted servant allowed through a guarded door. A suspicious sound that caused an emperor to wake. These moments may never have appeared in official records, yet they could influence what happened next. The private life of a ruler was connected to the public fate of an empire. This is especially true when we think about sleep. An emperor who slept well might wake refreshed. He might think clearly. He might listen patiently. He might make decisions with confidence. But an emperor who spent night after night awake could become exhausted, irritable, suspicious, or simply less capable of handling the enormous demands placed upon him. The ancient Romans did not have modern studies of sleep. They did not understand the brain in the way we do today. But they understood something very simple. A tired person does not always behave like a rested person, and when that tired person happens to be emperor, the consequences can be much larger. Imagine a ruler lying awake for hours. The next morning, a delegation arrives. They need a decision. The emperor is tired. The issue is complicated. He has little patience. Perhaps he makes a choice that he might have reconsidered after a good night's sleep. Perhaps the decision is small. Perhaps it is important. Perhaps it disappears into history without anyone knowing why it happened. This is the strange connection between private habits and public events. The historian sees the decision, but rarely sees the sleepless night behind it. The emperor's bedtime could also influence political relationships. A trusted servant who was allowed near the ruler at night gained unusual access. A physician who treated the emperor could become influential. A guard who protected the bedroom might become part of the ruler's inner circle. A companion who listened to private worries might earn a level of trust that others could never reach. In this way, the nighttime palace became a place where relationships were quietly formed. Power did not always grow in public meetings. Sometimes it grew in private rooms, in conversations held after midnight, in moments when the emperor was tired enough to lower his guard. And perhaps this is why Roman bedtime rituals are more interesting than they first appear. They were not merely habits, they were part of the machinery of power. The bath, the perfume, the meal. The physician, the guard, the dream interpreter, the entertainer, the servant. Every person involved in the emperor's night occupied a small position within a much larger system. Together, they created the environment in which the ruler could sleep. And because the emperor's decisions affected the empire, the ability to sleep became strangely connected to history itself. There is another lesson hidden here. The Romans believed that emperors were extraordinary. They placed statues of them across cities. They celebrated their victories. They recorded their laws. They built monuments in their names. But at night, the emperor became remarkably ordinary. He needed rest. He could become ill. He could feel afraid. He could have disturbing dreams. He could wake from a nightmare. He could lie awake wondering what tomorrow would bring. He could listen to music simply because he wanted to feel calm. The difference between emperor and ordinary person became smaller in the darkness, and Perhaps that is why the nighttime rituals of these rulers feel so strangely familiar. The details are ancient, the marble is ancient, the servants and guards belong to another world, but the human experience remains recognizable. We still prepare ourselves for sleep, we still search for comfort, we still worry when the night becomes too quiet, we still wake from dreams that feel important, we still hope that morning will bring clarity. The emperors of Rome were surrounded by extraordinary luxury, but they could not escape the ordinary needs of being human, and perhaps, centuries later, this is what remains most fascinating: the empire is gone. The palaces have fallen silent, the guards have disappeared, the servants no longer walk those corridors, but the question remains: what did an emperor think about in the final moments before sleep? What fears did he hide? Which dreams did he remember? Which decisions were made because of a restless night? And how many turning points in history began with a single person lying awake, long after everyone else had gone to sleep? We may never know. But as we imagine that quiet bedroom, the story is not quite finished, because after all the rituals, all the guards, all the medicines, and all the fears, there was still one unavoidable moment: morning, and tomorrow, the emperor would wake again. The palace is quiet once again, the morning has arrived, the emperor has risen, the guards have changed their posts, the servants have begun another day of work, and somewhere, perhaps behind thick marble walls, the bedroom remains exactly as it was when the night began. The bed is still there, the curtains hang quietly, the last traces of perfume linger in the air, a bronze lamp waits to be filled again when darkness returns, and perhaps, for a moment, we can imagine the room without its emperor, without the guards, without the servants, without the endless machinery of power, only silence. It is strange to think that such enormous history could unfold around a place as ordinary as a bedroom. The Roman emperors ruled one of the greatest empires the ancient world had ever known. They commanded armies, they governed provinces, they built monuments that still stand today. Their names were carved into stone, their faces appeared on coins carried across distant lands, and yet, every night, they still had to face the same simple necessity: they had to sleep, or at least, they had to try before sleep. They might have followed rituals that now seem strange. They bathed, they wore perfumes, they ate, they listened to music, they spoke with companions, they consulted physicians, they trusted guards, they watched for omens, they worried about dreams, and sometimes, despite everything, they simply could not rest. Perhaps this is the most surprising thing about the bedtime world of Roman emperors. The closer we look at their private lives, the less distant they seem. The emperor who feared assassination understood fear. The emperor who struggled to sleep understood exhaustion. The emperor who worried about dreams understood uncertainty. The emperor who needed a physician understood illness. The emperor who listened to music before bed understood the simple desire to feel peaceful. Behind the titles, behind the statues, behind the gold, there was a human being lying down in the darkness, and perhaps the darkness made everyone equal. A farmer sleeping beneath a simple roof, a soldier resting in a distant barracks, a merchant staying at an inn, a servant sleeping in a crowded room, and an emperor resting behind guarded doors. Their beds were different, their lives were different, their problems were different, but the need for rest was the same. Night after night, the empire slowly disappeared from the emperor's immediate view. The roads continued without him, the ships continued crossing the sea, the markets waited for morning, the provinces remained thousands of miles away. For a few hours, the world could continue without the emperor's attention. And perhaps that was the greatest lesson hidden inside these strange bedtime rituals. No matter how powerful a person becomes, there is always a moment when control must be surrendered. The emperor could command the guards, but he could not command sleep. He could summon physicians, but he could not guarantee health. He could surround himself with luxury, but he could not purchase peace of mind. He could ask priests about dreams, but he could never know exactly what the future would bring. And perhaps this is why the ancient Roman night still feels strangely close to us, because we understand the quiet moments. The final light before sleep, the thoughts that become louder when the world becomes silent, the strange dreams we remember in the morning, the comfort of hearing a familiar voice, the hope that tomorrow will be easier. The Romans lived nearly 2,000 years ago, yet in these small moments, they were not so different from us. So, as we leave the imperial bedroom behind, imagine the palace once more. The guards stand quietly, the lamps burn low. The emperor has finally closed his eyes. Outside, the city is sleeping. The vast Roman world is resting beneath the stars, and for one brief moment, nothing needs to be decided, no law needs to be written, no army needs to move, no messenger needs to arrive. There is only the quiet rhythm of breathing, the gentle darkness, and the slow passage of time. But perhaps, somewhere in that darkness, another dream is beginning. Perhaps the emperor sees something he cannot explain. A distant road, a silent temple, a face from the past, or perhaps a future that has not yet happened. If the ancient Romans were right, and dreams sometimes carried warnings, then maybe the final question is not what happened during the emperor's bedtime. Maybe the question is, what did the emperor see when he finally closed his eyes? Because history tells us what happened afterward. We know which emperors rose in the morning. We know which ones disappeared. We know which palaces became ruins. We know which names survived. But we will never know exactly what passed through their minds during those final quiet moments before sleep, and perhaps that mystery is better left unanswered. So tonight, as we step away from the silent palace, let the ancient corridors fade, let the lamps grow dim, let the marble walls disappear into the darkness, and remember, even the most powerful people in history once lay down at night, hoping, just like everyone else, that morning would come, and perhaps that is where our journey ends, or perhaps the night has only just begun.